like a U Ottawa panel, even though Katie's at Manitoba, but Marina Pavlovich and Katie Zlagi as our authors, and Pascal Chapdelain, a colleague who I'm fortunate to have here at Windsor Law, as our discussant. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Hey. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. So it's been a great joy reading this paper. I have to say, it was far more advanced than I expected. I didn't really know what to expect. I never participated in robot conferences before, but I think, and I told the authors already, it's really well advanced. It's extremely well researched, very well written, and I hope that the comments I'm going to give today, and of course the comments in the audience, the discussion it's going to trigger are really just going to help you sort of maybe rethink some of the scope, some of the structure of your paper to make it, like, I think it's very close to be ready to be submitted in my mind. So let's get started. I'll provide a quick summary of the paper just quickly, and then I'll go into some framework issues and then some more specific details. So Katie and Marina's paper is ambitious in scope. It's well researched and it's bold, and I would, as I will explain later, I think it can be even bolder, certainly with respect to contract theory section, and maybe a bit more inquisitive or open-ended in some of the other parts of the paper. So the authors ask, what does Gen AI mean for the formation, performance, and eventual adjudication of contracts? Does it further amplify the issues raised by massively distributed boilerplate contracts, or does it create a slate of new fundamental questions, like a really, really big question? So it starts with an overview of the tech involved in Gen AI. They call it a technological précis, so sort of a 101 sort of guidance for people who would be less versed with, how Gen AI is being used in contract. And they look at the modern law firm. And I have a scope question here I will get to in a moment, how Gen AI is being deployed in law firm environment. And then in the next part of the paper, they provide an overview of contract theory. I rely in great part on the works of Peggy Radin on boilerplate. Many of you are familiar with the works of Peggy Radin for non-negotiated standard form agreement. So I have a disclosure to make. I'm a big fan of Peggy Radin, and she's in fact a personal friend. So really, we're in good hands and we're in good company here. So that this part summarizes the key features of contract, and you emphasize that this is more like in an interdisciplinary mode or way of thinking for the people who are less maybe sort of in the know about contract theory. Basically, consent, the reliance on a legal system to support enforcement, and so forth. So you sort of lay out the 7 key rules that Peggy Radin uses in her theory. And then the 4 types of contracts that we see in a contract, whatever formation. So from the bespoke contract, which would be heavily negotiated, which would be respecting these sort of traditional conceptions we have about contract, to the machine type of contract, machine rule type of contract, and in between standard form agreements, customized clause, but which start from some boilerplate of some sort, would be like the, as you referred, the messy middle. And then you go on to apply 90s e-commerce automated agreements, contract theory, relying on the work of Ian Kerr, describing bots as digital agents and referring to the work and again, of Ian Kerr, and how self-executing contracts override the relational aspects of contracts, such as trust, promise, consent, and enforcement. And then the paper goes further, and this is like really a part I particularly enjoy in your paper. The part 4 then probes into Gen AI's impact on contracts from 3 perspectives. And what I really liked in this paper is how you draw on the work of Gulati and Scott, their empirical research on contracts, how they are being deployed, how they're being drafted in law firms, and how there's a heavy reliance on those standards that are just running around in the firm, lawyers not really knowing why the clauses are there, but they're still using them and so forth. I thought this part, and how you refer to it, really, really interesting. And in this part, you describe, in the context of trying to figure out, what's new with Gen AI, the contract drafter 3 positions, the lawyer harnessing Gen AI's power as a tool for legal practice, Then you refer to the contract taker, referring to Julie Cohen's earlier work, and I'm a big fan of Julie Cohen's work as well. The consumer was enjoined by GenAI-powered contract terms. And then you refer to the contract self-helper, which raises really interesting questions about access to justice, people who are looking for answers and asking GenAI how to draft a contract, how to get out of a bad contract, and so forth. One of the paper's conclusions, which ties to the title of the paper, is that contracts powered by GenAI increasingly resemble consensus ad artificialis. And you look again at Radin's 7 defining traits of contracts. And by that, you mean a manufactured agreement devoid of human relationality and steeped in procedural opacity. So the paper, as I said earlier on, is generally very well written with elegant prose. Like I point to the first part also, which was like it really is engaging the reader very quickly, and we want to read more. I think the biggest challenge of the paper, it's the challenge that you take in your research question is, yeah, so what's new with GenAI? You know, what has changed with GenAI compared to standard form agreements that we have learned to live with, that we have to get to know better, and the intensification of the internet. You know, everything is you know, there's a something you have to agree to pretty much everywhere. So what has really changed? I think that's the big challenge. That's the question for pretty much every panel, and I think that's pretty much the big question of We Robot since its inception, from what I can understand. And actually, it's not only the last 30 years in this case. I think when we think about standard form agreements, we go back to the railway ticket cases. That's 150 years old. So we're really going back a long way. I would say more than 30 years in the advent of the digitization of the internet. Yeah, and I say that because, you know, so those ticket cases are cases where when you would buy a ticket or you would send some luggage in the cloakroom in a railway facility, that you would agree to a limitation in liability on the back, and if it was not, or if it was displayed or announced to you, that you would be bound by that. So that's pretty much a precursor of what we've been living through in the last many years with the prevalence of boilerplate agreements. So I would say that the what's really new question is an important one for sure, even though in the end you might end up thinking that things are not that new. You know, and I would sort of push you a little bit more in recognizing that things may not be that new with GenAI. And it happens to me all the time, actually, when I write papers, because I like to look at new things. I like to look at and sort of just unpack them and see how general frameworks of law apply. And I think in the end, it's absolutely a worthwhile exercise, right? So I would, I think, you know, in some cases, I'm a bit skeptic about what's really new about GenAI. And I will give you some ideas about how you might think about a framework as to why, you know, there are some things that might not change so much. So I'll start with some overarching comments, and then I'll make some more specific comments about parts of the paper. So my first comment is the scope. So it's a very broad scope. So for example, part 1 of the paper talks about GenAI contract tools used by modern law firms. Contract theory part talks about contracts generally and also standards, so the negotiated one and the ones that are more boilerplate that we don't agree to. On the panel this morning, you know, we were reminded how nobody reads those terms and so forth. And then part 4 talks about the contract self-helper. So I think you may want to think through if you want to retain that scope. There's no harm in sort of keeping a broader scope. But if you do, I think you want to be more deliberate as to, you know, when you approach, make a specific point, what type of contract does it apply to? And maybe one idea for you is that one way to look at it would be to focus on standard form agreements. Which are raising like big access to justice, social justice issues, you know, people empowered to even resist or to do anything about it, and would also allow you to look at it from the contract drafter, the contract taker, and the self-help as well. So it would, I think, tie neatly into, you know, the end of your paper, which I really enjoy, by the way. So yeah, so that's my comment. The first one is about scope. The second one is about in my view, contract theory is highly jurisdiction dependent. So especially for how courts have enforced boilerplate agreements. So there's really quite a big divergence there. And again, I'm not, suggesting you should get very technical. This is what's happening in Europe. This is what's happening in Canada, in this province, and in the US. But I think you might want to choose, one jurisdiction, and, acknowledging that, the way that these boilerplate agreements have evolved and have been enforced and recognized or not recognized by court, there's quite a big variance. And you do focus on Canada, not surprisingly, which I think where there has been some interesting developments in the area of boilerplate. So just to give an example, the US examples are, there's replete with examples of enforcing abusive arbitration or limitation of liability clause on the basis of freedom of contract. In Canada, on the other hand, many provinces have a consumer protection law that make a compulsory arbitration clause non-enforceable. They just say straight out they're non-enforceable. So even if you put them in your contract, the Supreme Court of Canada has expanded on the doctrine of unconscionability, which is a really interesting decision you refer to with Dues and Facebook, and then with the Uber decision, where the court has expanded our understanding of unconscionability, which used to be more procedural, like if you had a strong illness, someone was trying to take advantage of, a lack of education and so forth, and move towards no. I mean, it can be substantive unconscionability if, you're totally sound of mind, in health, but, these terms are completely abusive. So I think that's a really interesting pushback on the enforceability of these clauses. And I think that's really something, to think about as we move into the further automation of these clauses. And then, of course, the EU has a more regulated digital contract sphere, both through its regulations and through its directive. And just to add more, some of the theories that are described don't fit very well in the civil law, while they might fit more in the common law and vice versa. So I think there's some maybe fine-tuning that I would recommend doing there, and maybe picking one jurisdiction more in particular. And I think in answering what's really new about Gen AI in the realm of contract, how it's being used for contract drafters, for contract takers, for self-helpers, as you refer to them, I think you may want to think about the various guardrails that exist that may in the end not make it so different. And I'll give you some examples. I think one other thing you might think about is the dance between industry contract drafting practices, how legislation responds, how judge-made law responds to that. The Supreme Court of Canada responds to making unconscionably broader and applicable to certain clauses in boilerplate is one example. And then the other thing as a guardrail you might want to think about, and you do, I'm not saying you're not, but I think these, like for me, as I was sort of studying your paper, it just helped me, think about why I think certain things are not so new. They may not change so much. Lawyers' professional obligations, of course. So, you can use Gen AI as much as you like. But at the end of the day, you have professional obligations, right? And you have a code of conduct that you're bound to as a lawyer in the profession. And you might be, and we've seen like big problems of people using Gen AI and appearing in court and citing cases that did not exist, for example. So I think that's an important guardrail to think about when we look at the impact that Gen AI may have on contract and in contract law generally, which is your question. I think one other thing you might think about, as I started reading your paper, I do a lot of work on personalization. I'm really interested in personalization in the sort of the algorithmic sphere, and I've done quite a bit of work on personalized pricing and the various problems that this poses, and how concealed this practice is and so forth. And I was thinking, one interesting about Gen AI might be personalization, right? So we can get to more personalized contracts and so forth. But then the more I think about it, I think the pull for big firms will always be towards maintaining standardization for all sorts of reasons, risk management, predictability. They might make it look, like maybe you're going to, as you're, agreeing to terms online, there's going to be bots like being your friend and holding your hand and choose this, Katie, choose this, Marina. this and that, and give you the illusion that this is a contract that is specifically designed for you, but this will all be, prefabricated and quite standardized in my view. So I don't think, I mean, there will be personalizations in some ways, but maybe not in the more positive ways that, we might first think of. And there's certainly a lot of this already going on in insurance contracts, as you may know, and how insurance companies are, in exchange for you giving all your personal data, your driving practices, we're gonna charge you maybe $50 less a year in your contract and so forth. So there is, there's definitely use of personalization, but not in the way I was first approaching this. As I was reading your paper, as a potential benefit to customize a contract more to the need of the user. I'm not sure that this is going to happen. And then the other thing, as a guardrail, you might think about, and I'm referring to the Disney case you're referring to in your case. So the Disney case is someone who died suddenly as of an allergic reaction while being at Disney World, and there were some buried terms and conditions that they were agreeing not to take any legal action and so forth that Disney tried to impose, but then the response was massive, social media outrage. So that's probably the biggest power that consumers have, and more, and it works. Sort of the reputation of a firm and how you can use that to your advantage, I think is an important guardrail to sort of the derailment that generative AI may bring us, or the changes that it may bring to contract law practice. Now I'm going to move on to more specific comments and questions, and I really can't wait to hear what everyone will have to say about your paper. There was one part in your paper where you talk, well, first about boilerplate theory, really foundational work by Peggy Radin. And then you move on to relational theory, and referring more to the work of Macaulay and Ian Kerr's work. And I was not sure about the transition here. I think I would want to be someone to take my hand and explain to me a little bit more why and how you're making that transition work. And then in the section where you talk about the three categories, the contract drafter, the contract taker, the contract self-helper, I think the latter overlaps with both the first one and second one. And you might want to think about that, like how you define these categories. And I think, that like the third one, the contract self-helper is going to be a contract drafter, is going to be a contract taker. Right, so I think you might want to articulate that a little bit more. And earlier I said you should be more bold on the contract theory part and upfront. And I will just give you an example. So you talk about Gilmore, Debt of Contracts, which was a paper written in the 70s. Oh my God, contracts are everywhere. They're not dead. They're very, very alive and kicking. And you say that at page 29. I would say that earlier, or I would just dismiss it. I would just say, whoa, like there's the excellent work of the end of ownership of Brzezinski and Schultz, who talk about that phenomenon. You think you own certain things, you don't own them, you cannot repair them. My work on copyright law and the intersection of the very physical world, talks about that as well. So yeah, I would rip this apart. Like you can go and many other parts. And we can talk a bit more about the contract theory part, because I think there's a lot of part that I think you could take on more, strenuously. I have to say, contract law, and I've been teaching it for 10 years, there's legal fiction everywhere in every area of law. But contract law has so many legal fictions that are like sort of the pinnacle of, how contracts work, meeting of the minds and consent and all these things. And we all know that even for negotiated contracts, I practiced law for many years. I doubt that it's even there. Autonomy, yeah, of course, it happens in some cases, but there are so many cases where it doesn't, right? So I think you could take that on even more strongly than you do. You make a reference to private law. So I would ask, why you refer to private law. I just wrote a paper about the interaction between the intersection of private law and copyright after a conference I attended. People from Europe, from the US, Canada, Hong Kong, China, like there were people from all over the world, and then really, really leading experts in private law theory. And at the conference, we quickly realized that we had a very, very different view about what private law means. Just to give you an example, for some people, it excludes statutory law as the ordering between private parties. Anyway, you might want to not refer to it, or if you do, anyway, I might have some suggestions for you as to how you might want to refer to it, if you think it's still necessary to refer to private law. In terms of methodology, I mean, this, as I said, this paper is very well researched. There's a lot of, you rely on a lot of great sources. You show both your knowledge and expertise in the area. There's no doubt about that. But maybe you want to say a bit more about the methodology to the extent that you're referring to those various tools that are being used for Gen AI contracts. And I'm referring to Contract Ken. I was seeing Ryan Gosling as I was reading this, but no, I think it refers to something else. Ken, I looked it up, actually it refers to knowledge. Yeah, so maybe you want to say a bit more about what you looked at in terms of the sample of Gen AI tools that are out there. And then in your conclusion, you talk about sort of, going back to trust, consent, and then there's enforcement. What is it? No, sorry. There's trust, promise, consent, and then enforcement. You may want to think about, how much has changed. I think on the enforcement part, maybe that this is one area where Gen AI may change things, but you may want to rethink how much change. But you take it wholesale, like you talk about the changes happening on all of those fronts. So my question is like, you may want to rethink that a little bit. And then I will end with some questions, and I think I already gave you maybe a lot of things to talk about. And maybe I will take on a sacred cow here. Maybe you're going to kick me out of this conference. I don't know. But I just question what's the real value of talking about the agency theory. And I know it's talked a lot about sort of in contract theory, starting in the 90s and everything. It just seems to me, I'm not saying it would never apply. For me, the agency sort of framework is a way to sort of divide liability between parties. It's a way to identify, well, actually, you think this is a party to a contract. It is not. It's just the agent. The real party is the principal. And I wonder if with standard form agreements or even with Gen AI, if there is really an agent. I just wonder if it's not always, in most cases. I don't care what you use. I don't care which bots you're using in your business. At the end of the day, Air Canada is liable. And we had the recent case of MOFAT where Air Canada used bots who answered to a customer that they could get discounts for bereavement, emergency flight. But the bot was wrong, and Air Canada said, "Oh, it's the bot. It's not us." And the court didn't buy that, right? Eventually. So I just wonder what are those cases? What does it add to the discussion? And again, I know this is like a big thing that people, a lot of people talk about agency theory. I just need, more explanation. And then I love the idea of relational theory. The relational theory, I think, is a fascinating theory in regulation. The wonderful work of Jennifer Nedelsky is definitely one proof. Karis Craig, who works on relational theory and copyright. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting applications. I'd like to hear more about how you think it's an important theory to use here. And then I have 1 minute left. I'd like to hear more about the title. I like consensus because consensus, of course, means agreement. It also means something in computing language. So I think it's a nice sort of play with word here. But how artificialist and how more artificialist are we? I'd like to hear you more about that. Yeah, so wonderful paper. Like really, I really enjoyed it. It made me rethink about sort of preconceived ideas I have about contract. And, yeah, wonderful. That's all I have to say.
Oh, dear. And okay. Well, thank you, Pascal. Thank you for those generous comments. And I'm reminded, sitting here in this wonderful space with these beautiful people, that the most
generous thing that you can do is like really engage with somebody's work and think about it really hard and offer them comments. And you often enter academia wanting that, and then there are precious few opportunities where we actually do it. And what a beautiful gift that is, like your time and attention, paying attention to the work that we did. So thank you. Yeah, I feel really excited to be here and to be talking about this topic. And a few things in response. So I think one of the animating conversations that we want to reflect through the paper is about like what is at the heart of the contractual agreement when we are privileging freedom in a conversation about private law. So in a conversation about I have the ability to enter into an agreement with somebody, and that is going to be legally enforceable by the state, but I am making choices about what that is, right? Is there something free that gets undercut by automation? And if that is or isn't the same as standard form contracts, I think is a worthy investigation. And yeah, maybe we do get to the conclusion that it's not that different, but I do think there are a few things that are different. And the thing, and perhaps we have to like work to draw out the threads a little bit to get this crystal clear in the final draft. But one of the things that I think is really problematic when we're thinking about automating these kind of functions, right, is like to what degree does the narrative imagination drop out of the conversation, right? To what point do we end up with a quantified version of reality that approximates reality but doesn't approximate the relational aspect that the legal theory was designed to replicate when the legal fiction was constituted? And so that is how I see relationality as being part of a conversation in terms of, so much of life is about relationships. If we have a relational framework that allows us to center a narrative conversation and a narrative self, and then we overly quantify that and it drops out, is something fundamental lost? And I think that there is. And so that is something that I want to, I think, pick up on in the next version of this. And I also think that, right, if you look at what the Supreme Court says in Bazin, right, in Bazin and Renew, for those of you from an American legal tradition, is a 2014 case from the Supreme Court of Canada where they recognize the duty of good faith as it pertains to contracting parties, right? So contracting parties generally on notice that you have a responsibility to engage in good faith with your contracting partners. And the Supreme Court is quite broad about what that duty of good faith looks like. But when we see automated incarnations of all these things, and we have this tremendous power imbalance that is perpetuated through, various kinds of click wrap or other automated contracts, to what degree do we, overemphasize or overprivilege the idea of commercial freedom at the risk of some kind of duty of good faith? I also really love that you picked up on the agency theory. I was very much considering leaving it out altogether, but it also did seem slightly sacrilegious to write a paper for a technology law audience without talking about agent theory and artificial agents. And like, there's a whole thread of scholarship, right, that really takes seriously that idea of the electronic intermediary and what does that do to contract theory in a digital age. And so part of what we wanted to do in terms of the contribution of this paper was to trace that lineage and to trace that conversation about like how have people changed what they're talking about in the contracting space since the late 1990s. But maybe it is definitely only valuable as a historical lens, as opposed to being an animating conversation for what's happening right now. And I think Marina can add to that through the lens of consumer protection law, and particularly through the lens of some of these standard form agreements, which is her specialty.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Oh, yes, you can hear me. I am going to echo Katie's thanks, Pascal, for engaging with our paper. And I will publicly admit it was very difficult to write, partly because there was Ian's shadow and the work that he has done. And also then there's Katie on the other hand, and like her incredible brain. And then trying to pack everything that we really wanted to say in a paper that's really more for like a lifelong project. I think one of the things that I really liked, and so Pascal, you talked about the drafter, taker, self-helper, and for me, that was a really important piece. And I'll tell you, like I've been working on standard form contracts for over 20 years now. And a lot has changed, but also most of it hasn't changed. And I think we have tried to regulate them in different manners across various jurisdictions, including in Europe, that has probably the most stringent regulation, and it still hasn't really produced meaningful effects. So any form of regulation that we introduced in terms of either particular clauses are unenforceable, you still have them, but they say to the extent permitted by law, and then blah, blah, blah. So they haven't disappeared. We haven't really managed to actually allow people access to justice to actually challenge these clauses. And I call them kitchen sink clauses. We're going to throw everything in and then something will stick. And because there is really no incentive to challenge anything, they just continue being perpetuated. And so I think the drafter part for us is a very significant piece, because the regulation hasn't really produced the results that we want. And we want to really focus and go behind the scenes on the drafters of these contracts and try to figure out if there are any professional obligations beyond the existing ones which really don't work. And that's where we sort of want to go, jumping off from this paper into really learning how lawyers actually conceptualize drafting these contracts and how they use the tools. Because I think our fear is the tools are just the tools that exist and are propping up every day are just going to perpetuate the status quo and make it worse. And so we agree with you, contracts are not dead, they're very much alive. And we now have these like super contracts that are going to be machine drafted and machine enforced. And it's going to be even harder to even break in that particular cycle. And the inequalities that that's going to perpetuate are just going to be much worse than what we're seeing already. So for me, the drafter part is like, I like the theory, but the drafter part is where I would hope that we will be able to make some inroads in terms of changing the status quo, because I think we do need to change it. And what I thought was really interesting in the previous panel, when our physician friend said, like, I don't know what you think about fine print. I'm like, oh, we have a lot to say about fine print. and the piece that we haven't talked about in the paper, we talked about various ways where these contracts are super contracts. The other piece is also, we haven't talked about what happens with the data that's being collected. And then now that data is used to train other models. And in the agreement, you agree to all of that. And so what's going to come out of it? So for us, there are lots of interconnected pieces, and you're right, like it's a big paper, but we're trying to figure out if we can make it as a foundational piece for a few other papers or projects that are going to come out of it, that we would really sort of mark the territory of what we find problematic and then expand in as much as we can in this paper, but really moving out in other projects as well. And we are more than happy to receive feedback and comments from a 20-year-old cat, a bossy cat. Hi, Sue.
Hi, everyone. Sue Gluck, employed by my cat, formerly employed by Microsoft. And in my early days at Microsoft and the job I had before that, working for sort of a tech company that you've never heard of, I am a drafter of contracts of adhesion, or I was. Also bespoke negotiated deals. But I'm, talking to you as a person who committed all the sins, but tried to be a little bit better. I'm also a person who went from being a litigator to being a transactional lawyer without tons of preparation. So I approached it, there was no silo in my head. I did legal research to see how do judges think about these things. And I think that's yet another silo. You've got the practices of transactional lawyers you've got litigators and how they see things. And then you've got judges. And, judges don't care what is traditional for transactional lawyers. They interpret independently. And of course, in the US, most judges used to be litigators. So maybe they are in the litigator silo, I'm not sure. But transactional lawyers, as it turns out, don't care how judges interpret things, because I would come to a meeting and say, well, I found this case that I really think you should read because your disclaimer of liability is not good, and nobody wants to hear it. So anyway, sorry, this is not group therapy. As much as
Okay, Stu, before you move on, I'm going to say then you're a unicorn in the legal world, because most transaction lawyers really don't care what litigators think, and litigators don't really care what so the fact that you have both in your head really makes you a unicorn. So.
Well, thank you. I think it was more about my imposter syndrome than anything else, that I would go to the law library on the weekends to research what I was working on, because I did feel like in the beginning I was somewhat incompetent. I got better over time. So I'm sorry, I tried to be really logical and organized, and it just didn't come out that way. I selfishly enjoyed the US law portions and the Canadian portions. Love that Supreme Court case on unconscionability. That's a thing I could never understand, why other people didn't seem to care that they were including clearly unconscionable terms in their end user license agreements. And so I had a practice of putting stuff like that up at the top, so you couldn't avoid, even if you just clicked I agree, you couldn't help but see it. Not the usual stuff, not the stuff in all caps, but something unusual that I thought the user deserved to know and possibly reject. And I thought that would help with the problem of unconscionability. I mean, obviously I wasn't trying to be unconscionable, but rather to make the end user a little better informed. Nobody else does that, and I'm a weirdo for trying. But you guys knew I was a weirdo. Okay, so your focus is on contract law's future with Gen AI enabled legal practice. I found myself yearning for your paper to really have a second purpose, which is to, and maybe this is another paper, and maybe it's not your paper at all, I don't know, but to focus on what are human lawyers' future in this world of Gen AI contracts. And as Pascal mentioned, we have an ethical obligation not just to shove it at a bot and run away, right? And I think that nobody is really thinking about that as they're using this technology, just happy to reduce the 3.5 minutes down to 30 seconds, as you note. I think it's worth taking a look at an older We Robot paper by Deirdre Mulligan and Daniel Klutz, Berkeley, Automated Decision Support Technologies and the Legal Profession. They did field work looking at, like stuff like e-discovery stuff, and to see, well, how much were lawyers involved? What about at the vendors? Was that lawyers supervising the software developers? Newsflash, it was not. And so are the people who use that, I mean, discovery is horrible. Like it's horrible. I'd rather be like beaten by sticks than do discovery again. But you can't just automate it and think that that's okay, because the technology is never going to get it completely right, and sometimes not really right at all. Like, for example, attorney-client privilege review, et cetera. So I recommend that article I also recommend Karen Levy at Cornell, her article on smart contracts, book smart, not street smart, blockchain-based smart contracts, and the social workings of law, where the point is basically you know, contracts, even these contracts of adhesion can be about relationships. And it's in some ways, the words don't even matter to people. Like, I think you point this out, that it's about what's customary between them. But the words should matter to people, and it shouldn't just be, sort of garbage. Um, I, I have another reason to worry about agentic AI cranking out these contracts. Um, as an overworked in-house lawyer, I used to have clients come to me and say, I need a contract. And I would say, great. What's it about? What's the deal we're doing? What kind of program are you trying to set up? Like, what's the other side going to give you? What are they going to get? And vice versa. And they would say, can't you just give me a contract? Aren't you a lawyer? And I cannot tell you how many different people at more than one company would have these nonsensical conversations with me where my response, of course, was, well, if you were building a house, would you not have architectural plans? Or would you just tell a builder, build me a house? When the builder asked you, how many bathrooms do you want? Aren't you a builder? Can't you just build me a house? And I really think that, um, you've got that pressure from the client to get the contract done in 30 seconds instead of 3.5 minutes or 3.5 days or whatever it takes. And that really concerns me when it's way too easy. Or for them, one very memorable time was out for a family member's funeral, and the clients wrote their own contract. It was terrible. It gave the corporation a lot of unnecessary risk, but they were impatient. They want to wait 2 days. So there we have it. Anyway, I love your paper. Oh, I wanted to ask, is AI-driven enforcement really a big worry? This is not a thing that I would, so maybe more explanation about why it's a worry, because it sounds horrible, but I wasn't aware that was really, really a thing. I I do love the hope towards the end of the paper, your hopeful look that Gen AI may remedy the information imbalance between the parties. I would love that. With the development of further tools, it may also be possible to compare and contrast the terms of competitor services relatively accurately. That is not the case. From my experience with trying to get P3P to be a thing for companies to state their privacy practices in an automated way, so you could just have your browser tell you, well, you could tell your browser, I'm okay with this, I'm not okay with that. And it could warn you, oh, get away from this website. Oh, no, this website's great for your preferences. You have to code the language. Nobody agrees on what the coded portion should mean. So going, I don't think it's possible, but maybe I need to stop being so cynical. Anyway, thank you for a wonderful paper. And I can't wait to see where you go with it. And I know Ian is smiling down from heaven. Good job.
Dude, you got to say that at the end. Come on.
I'm sorry.
Come on.
But if I make myself cry at the beginning, then it's hard to give feedback.
True.
Oh, and I killed it in the room too.
Okay.
Not in a good way.
Okay, thank you, Sue. That was, again, you're a unicorn in so many different ways. I think your reflection from how it works in practice is really important, because that's what I think really concerns us. And so some of these tools that we're seeing where we think they're marketing ploys, we don't really know how that's going to go. And so I think Katie and I share a concern that the current professional obligations are not enough. and that people are going to be pushed to use the tools for efficiency's sake without knowing what actually gets spit out at the end. And if AI enforcement continues, I think that is the biggest problem, right? Because then you have a completely closed system with zero insight and zero ways to actually, Leonard Cohen has the thing that's like, whatever, there's a crack and that's how the life gets into it, whatever. In the song, I think here, like in these contracts currently, we still have some cracks where it can get into. If you have a completely closed system, there are no cracks and you can't actually audit anything. And so I think that's a huge concern on top of everything that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. And I see contracts as an added layer of enforcement to everything. And that really concerns me. So keeps me up at night. And so we're going to try our best, but where we end up, I don't really know.
Well, I love it. I do think you should think about maybe, is there a follow-on paper?
Yeah. So our goal is actually to like build out a whole grant around this, which would involve empirical research into how people are using automated tools within law firm environments. And so the reminder of that Deirdre Mulligan piece is a good one, because I remember that we wrote that paper and I liked it a lot. And it is something similar. Like I have a whole memo on electronic commerce that didn't make it into, on e-discovery that didn't make it into this paper, but it's sort of a similar investigation in terms of, all right, now there's this new tool. You have an ethical obligation to the client to be technologically competent, to be using the latest and greatest tools, right? To be delivering service in a fast, efficient, technically proficient manner. And people are enthusiastic about integrating the tools into their practice. So what does that look like in terms of understanding the downstream consequences of the data collection? What does that look like in terms of just understanding the privacy consequences of the solicitor-client relationship? But what does it look like just in terms of crunching out a supercharged version of boilerplate that doesn't have that narrative imagination? And what does that do?
Well, I would.
If I can add on that, yeah, that's the part that, the contract drafter and the whole process, and, the title of that section is usurpation of, my French accent is just in the way, but usurpation of thoughts, like how is that going to work? That I find like really there's a paper in there. I agree. So I agree with Sue. And I think you mentioned that, Marina, as well. Absolutely. I would reinforce that also, but not in this one. Get this one out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and
another one, several others.
I would think expansively. I would think about writing something that's akin to an op-ed for like a bar association type of publication. So you're reaching people and you're encouraging them to ask their software vendors questions that really they should ask. And in fact, if you produce a series of questions, maybe you can get auditors interested, because as a law firm, like each law firm doesn't want to go through this arduous process, but perhaps, auditors love doing this. And perhaps ultimately there could be some kind of certification scheme or, meeting a certain kind of standard. So I love this, but I think that I want it to be all things to all people when paper can't do that, but I think you've really got something here. So thank you.
I think Bianca wants.
Yeah, I got a story. I actually have a story that I'm curious if it can sing with this in some way. My daughter went to a rock climbing gym for a birthday party, and they asked me to fill in a form, which was a waiver. And in the waiver, there was a piece of copy that said that my child had been trained in gymnastics or rock climbing. So it was obviously intended for someone who was doing these lessons all the time or doing it all the time. And what I realized is that with paper contracts, I always strike stuff, initial and return. So I'm just wondering if, you talk about that light, like to me, this is obviously a more prior piece of this digital transformation chain. But just in these tools, if you saw anything that actually tried to level a little bit of power back to the recipient or any editorial, because for me, it blocks it entirely every time, but I've only touched a couple. So just curious if this piece of the sort of power structure prompts any further thoughts or anything that you saw in that didn't make it in the paper that kind of was in here.
So I think I do the same thing. I think we're cut off the same cloth. No surprise. And in paper contracts, you're right, like it's easy to do, like you strike it out. It's like your problem, not mine anymore. We haven't seen anything that allows for the digital equivalent. And if you actually read all of those contracts, there are usually clauses that say individual, so like Apple or whoever, it's like individual salesperson actually has no authority to do anything. So they're supercharging you that way. Even so, in the paper equivalent, you could possibly do that. In digital, you can't. And even if you interact with a human, the human actually has no agency and authority to do that. So it would be actually an interesting thing to conceptualize through the technology. Can you do that? And what kind of rebalancing that might achieve. So thank you.
Just you reminded me of what happened here. They didn't have a paper thing they could send me. So first they sent me the form and I didn't want to do it. And then they said, oh, you can do this at the desk. And we got into a long conversation, which sort of confirmed that they didn't have a paper route anymore. And the woman was like, why don't you just click the thing? Who's working at the rock climbing gym, just to confirm your, but is there anything, it just prompts the question. Cause I'm always wondering about redundancy. Are you allowed to only have the contracting go? It seems yes, that you can always just force people to have the digital. Has there been any legal, like you have to have a redundancy or you have to have an analog? If you go to, just to share the end of this story, for me, it's wild in Toronto. You can't get paper tickets to go to the soccer game.
Mm-hmm.
That's insane to me. I don't know how that's legal, but it's all private, so that's how it's legal. But I'm just wondering if there's anything in this world about that sort of, it's all just.
That I'm thinking, and again, the conversation you and I had in the world of telecoms, we forced them to have paper bills for people who want them. Right. So like all the telecoms went to digital bills, and we said, okay, for lots of folks who are vulnerable, digital bills actually don't work out. So the regulator forced them to have them by request. So we might, like, I think it's a good sort of path to explore as well. Okay, thank you.
Consumer law require, like in Ontario, I don't know about the new one. I don't know if this has changed, but you have to send at least a copy that you could print. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
But after the fact.
Yeah, can be after the fact. Yeah.
Not before. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Jen Rasso from McGill University. And this paper had me thinking in a lot of different kind of directions. So I'm hoping that what I offer here is coherent. But that's in part because I think it struck a chord with some past research that I did on infrastructure contracts. So field work with Mariana Valverde on kind of deal making in big transportation projects. And we explored, I think, some of the features of contracting that your paper digs into, including like the degree to which even on the biggest of deals, anyone knows what's in the contract in the first place. So there's really interesting work on infrastructure contracting in Ontario that Mariana was publishing that might be of interest to thinking about like what contracts are doing. And the reason I say that is because I think sometimes in contract law and contract theory, the contracts, as you noted, Pascal, is kind of like there's all these legal fictions, but there's not a lot of sensitivity to significant differences in types of contracts. And so I think especially in this paper, one thing I was thinking about was how important it was when you're drawing on the context of the law firm and what's happening in the law firm, how that looks to be different depending on the type of contract that's at issue. So so I offered that as something that might be useful to think about as you're building out the theory. And then in that line of thinking too, I was wondering what type of professional behavior or activities are we thinking about as we're thinking about the creation of contracts and how contracts operate? So we can think about contracts as deal making, and all of the kind of transactional relationships and the need for speed and et cetera, staying on top of the latest technology to make the deal quickly, and so on. We can think about contracts as something that's instrumental in terms of managing relationships over time, as something that's central to litigation, and this intersects with kind of generative AI and its impact on writing. We can think of contracts as writing, as like something that requires lawyers to turn their minds to something, in addition to the parties to turn their minds to something. And so with that in mind, I wanted to suggest a book on AI and writing that I thought might be useful. It's by John Warner, called More Than Words. Yeah. So I thought this might be helpful because contracts also are words on a page that get written. And some of the kind of the need for speed and taking out the human labor and thinking that goes into writing contracts, I think is also what you're pointing a finger at. And so I thought that might be a useful kind of way of, I don't know, getting at some of what I think your paper is doing. So I wanted to offer that too. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Are we at the time? Okay, we're good. Okay. Oh, sure. Or do you want to announce it or? Yeah. So we told you there was a surprise yesterday for those who sign up to our social media, LTech Lab social media, also distribution list. And the surprise has materialized, right? But I can share the surprise. Yeah. Ooh, and there's going to be two surprises. So one of the prizes, I'll start with I don't have it, the fabulous book that is coming out. We Robot Lab 2, so there will be one copy that's going to be, part of the draw, one of the prizes. And the second surprise, the exciting surprise we were talking to you about yesterday, is one of the an exemplaire, a copy of the art piece. Can I say it this way? For those of you who are at the party on Thursday night, and there was a robotic arm doing some art based on some input, very much, within the theme of this conference. So there is one copy of this, I think, very, very cool art piece that is going to be part of the draw. So we invite those of you who have not signed up to our newsletter or to do so at the break, and we're going to announce the winner at the end of the day. Okay, so have a nice break, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to our authors.
So there's